So, when I lived in Spain, I used to go every once in a while to a place called VIPs, or VIPs like they call it there. And there was this dish that I would order about 70% of the times I went there, the Oriental chicken sautéed. And what I liked about it was that it was made of 50% stuff that I eat on a regular basis, like rice and chicken, so I knew what to expect about that. 30% was stuff that I thought was exotic, and the remaining 20% I would describe as stuff that I never thought could be used in a dish like this, but still seemed to work pretty well with the rest of the ingredients. It was also seasoned and dressed with a thick spiced sauce that wasn't quite like anything I had tried before. It was definitely not perfect though. It was polluted with broccoli, which I do not like at all. And it didn't matter in which of the restaurants of the chain I ordered this dish, they always somehow managed to fuck up the rice. And it was white rice. Who fucks up white rice? I don't even fuck up white rice, man. And your standard Taco Bell combo is hot cuisine compared to some of the shit I cook. And that's Tyranny in a nutshell. Thank you for watching, and never stop gaming. Bye everyone. Nah, I never do that to you guys, especially since you have been asking for this one for a long time. So I guess we're here to answer that one big question. What's the big fucking deal with this game? Let's find out, shall we? Welcome to Ye Olde Entertainment. My name is Alex, and as you know, it is my duty, my mission, my purpose in life to help you decide whether that game that you have been thumbing for so long is indeed the right game for you or not. And this is a juicy one. Is this the criminally underrated masterpiece that stands as testimony of just how shitty the taste of the mainstream RPG audience is? Or is this an undercooked, overhyped game that failed to meet the most basic expectations of die-hard RPG fans, thus setting itself to failure and subsequent oblivion? Or is the truth somewhere in between? Spoiler alert, it's somewhere in between. Tyranny is an isometric CRPG that takes place in a unique medieval high fantasy world, and one of the many things that are unique about this game is its character creation and character progression system. You still create a character in this game, and you still have a bunch of categories filled with options to play around with, as you do in every isometric RPG. But in Tyranny, it works differently. Let's see how. In this world, there are only humans, so there are no races for you to choose from. What, no dwarves?
0 out of 10.
Nah.
That's alright.
You don't choose a class per se either in Tyranny, but you have a bunch of other choices that sort of work like a class. You can choose a primary and a secondary expertise, and this works more or less like multi-classing. Both of these expertise options come with a choice of a talent or a spell. When you're done choosing your areas of expertise, you are taken to the attributes step of the character creation interface. In it, you'll see a list of attributes. The ones that are supposed to be the most important for your areas of expertise will be marked as such. And of course, you'll get a pool of points to spend on attributes as you see fit. And you can also min-max at will. And this all more or less works like a D&D computer game and many other games in the genre. You will also notice that these attributes add multipliers to your skills. Might, for example, adds a 1.5 multiplier to your sword and shield skill, and a 0.5 multiplier to your athletic skill, which is needed to pass skill checks that take place during conversations or while you're out there exploring the world. Later on in the game, you'll level, of course, and you'll be given a point to spend on an ability. There are several talent trees, but these talent trees do not depend on your choice of expertise, which means that you will always get the same talent tree regardless of which 2 areas of expertise you choose when you create your character. And these abilities are not locked behind attribute thresholds. They are tiered abilities most of the time, which means that you can unlock them if you have unlocked the previous tier of the given ability and or if you have invested enough points in the corresponding talent tree. I am not a fan of this system, and I am also not crazy about most of the abilities that you have at your disposal in this game. In RPGs, I generally first decide what I want my character's functional role in the party to be. I ask myself, do I want to be the party's tank, its healer, a DPS specialist, or a wildcard type of character? And then I make sure I choose the best class or combination of classes, skills, attributes, and items for the role I decide to play. But this is not an easy thing to do in Tyranny, because this game doesn't strictly follow any of the 2 tried and true character creation formulas. In D&D games, or the Pathfinders or the Pillars of Eternity series, you have classes, archetypes, and multi-classing, which in turn translates into multi-archetyping. Because you can be class A.1 and B.2, or A.2 and B.2 for example. Building your character occurs on a 2-tier based system, and this determines which abilities you will have access to, a talent tree if you will. And then you have the Divinity Original Sin 2/Elder Scrolls approach, in which you have a broad array of abilities that belong into disciplines or specialties or some other taxonomy system. The main character and its companions are free to learn any of them as long as they have a good enough value of the attribute they depend on. What we see in other games is mostly just hybrids of these two systems. And both of these approaches are valid. Some players prefer the former, some the latter, but Tyranny prefers none of them. It goes its own way, and it is a way that didn't work for me most of the time. It trivialized choices that should have been important and made character creation and leveling kinda boring. Take a look at this example. I'm trying to roll a tank here, so I choose Sword and Shield as my first expertise because it seems to be the most tank-oriented expertise, telling by its description. And because we chose that particular expertise, we can now choose one of these two talents as our starting talent. Now let's choose our second expertise. Let's choose Javelin. Because pulling is part of a tank's job, no? Gotta get the attention of the baddies as quickly as possible, right? Okay, let's move on to attributes then. Wait, why do I choose my name for my attributes?
You guys are weird!
Wait, what? The recommended attributes are Might, Finesse, and Quickness, not Vitality? Well, let's read what these attributes do then. Oh, so Might makes you hit harder, which I don't much care about because I want my character to be first and foremost about surviving damage, not dealing it. But it also increases my endurance defense. Okay, that sounds tanky. What does the endurance defense protect me from? Well, let's read what endurance does. Endurance defense. Endurance resists attacks on the internal physical system of the character, poison, disease, stun, etc. It is defined by the character's resolve and might attributes, but can also be influenced by equipping items, talents, and effects from spells and potions. Right. That sounds like a constitution-y kind of thing, but okay. What about Finesse? So Finesse gives you deflection. When a character is attacked and the result has been determined, the target's deflection percentage is checked. Deflection can reduce an attack by a one-hit result. Grace can convert to a miss. Deflection is a property of equipable clothing and armor, and it is also present in talents and abilities. I don't know, Rick. In other games, this is a rather roguish type of attribute to have, and that sounds like a roguish type of defense. In any case, I suppose those attributes make me harder to hit and more resilient to damage. But shouldn't I also have a large health pool? I'm just not comfortable starting a game in which I'm meant to be the party's tank without boosting my character's base health, so I am going to min-max a little. Now let's wait until we level to see if there are any abilities that'll make me a little bit tankier, because we do not get a roadmap of these abilities as we do in games like Pathfinder or Pillars.
A few minutes later.
Well, ding, I leveled. Let's check out those talents and see what this bad boy of a game has to offer to a tanky boy like me. Yeah, okay. Greater shield bonuses, better armor bonuses, less heavy armor recovery time penalty. Well, there's a taunt ability there, I suppose. Okay, so nothing to oh boy or oh wow about. Yeah, I don't know, man, I'm not feeling it. In these other games, these talents, these spells, they give me a tanky vibe, a tanky feeling that I'm just not getting in this game. Okay, how about we roll a magic user instead and try to become a DPS specialist?
A few minutes later.
Ding, I leveled.
Doesn't anyone notice this? I feel like I'm taking crazy pills!
Wait, are these the same talents I got before when I rolled a weapon and shield specialist?
You see, that's gonna be a problem.
Wait, there are no summons in this game?
That's gonna be a problem.
How about curses that make enemies attack each other? No?
That's gonna be a problem.
Mind control? No? Nope, not getting the magic feeling here either. And this is my main gripe with the character creation and progression system in this game. I didn't feel like it was geared towards helping you create a character that would fulfill a role in the party, and the abilities available didn't feel like they were tactically relevant or even fun. The leadership talent tree is perhaps the most tactical, useful, and original of the lot, but you only start to get the good stuff later on in the game, and of course, there is opportunity cost at play. So basically, if you want your character not to be a complete pushover, you'll have to almost fully commit to one of these talent trees and not spread your talent points too thinly, because again, the good stuff, and not only for the leadership talent tree, but for all talent trees, is in the highest tiers of these trees. My problem with most RPGs when it comes to leveling and acquiring abilities is that I have a hard time choosing which ability not to acquire when I level, because I want all of them. And in these games, in the good ones that is, I spend hours fiddling around with the options available every time I level, and when I'm done, I'm always hyped about leveling again, because there were so many abilities that I just couldn't acquire. In Tyranny, I often had the opposite problem when I leveled. I also spent hours on the leveling interface, but it was trying to decide which abilities were less useless, especially early on in the game. One good thing about Tyranny though, one very good thing actually, is that your companions each have their unique talent trees, and some of those have abilities that are actually pretty cool and tailored to a function. Barrick is clearly a tank, Lantry is obviously a healer, and this somewhat compensates the dullness of the leveling experience in Tyranny. Every time you level you also get a point to spend on the attribute of your choice. Though some stats are more important than others, depending on your areas of expertise, there are no wrong attributes to put points into. Because the game does not want you to hyper-focus on specific functions, everyone needs a little bit of everything in Tyranny. Almost. And here you can see how increasing this or that attribute affects all of your skills. And skills are important in this game, because there are a lot of dialogue options and explorable areas that are locked behind a skill check. And I like this a lot because skills play a role in the overall immersion aspect of the game. You also have an assortment of histories to choose from in the character creation interface. These histories are backgrounds. And as it happens in other RPGs, you get a few background-specific dialogue options. And I am happy to report that these have a greater impact in Tyranny than they do in most other games, because they are actually useful to help you earn favor and wrath to forge alliances with the different communities of the world. And this is all a big part of the game in Tyranny. As for the histories themselves, some of them were pretty cool, but none of them extraordinary, and more importantly, none of them got my role-playing juices flowing as they did, for example, in Arcanum. But then again, backgrounds in that game are just the very best ever. The thing is, I wasn't all that crazy about being a soldier or a pit fighter or any of these other things. The character creation and progression system in Tyranny is awkward, and if it had not been for the combined attacks that you can perform with your companions and the leadership talent tree, my character would have felt like the most generic combatant in the party most of the time. You walk about with a party of 4 in Tyranny, and early on in the game you meet Barrick, who is 100% meant to be the party's tank. He even has a taunt talent almost from the get-go, and many other tank-oriented abilities. So if you are planning to be your party's tank,
I got some bad news for you, sunshine.
Especially because your party is a party of 4. Also, none of your abilities has any use whatsoever outside of combat. Forget about using a leap-like ability to get to inaccessible places, or magic missiles to tear down a tree to use it as a walkway to access a shortcut or anything like that. While there was a lot of creativity put into some aspects of the game in Tyranny, making character talents and level design work together to provide an immersive user experience wasn't one of them. Skill checks are for conversations and skill checks in an area, and talents are for combat. That's it. So far, so fucking horrible, right? Well, yeah, but there are a couple of things that I liked a lot about character creation in Tyranny. Some of which are mind-blowingly
amazing.
After you are done creating your character, you still have to round up things for it by deciding its recent past. And you do this through the Conquest mini-game. This mini-game is the best motherfucking thing I have ever seen in my life. Okay, maybe not so much, but it's awesome. You see, the world of Tyranny, its people, its conflicts, they have all existed for a long time, long before you came into the picture. The story of the game cuts to the chase, which is good. Kairos has conquered almost the entire world, but a small bastion of resistance remains down in the south. So the Overlord has sent his 2 most important armies to take care of business, and they are having a hard time flushing these rebels out. And that's where you come in. But who are you? In which capacity are you involved with the war? Where do you stand with these 2 armies? And with the people in these places? What transpired before this particular episode of the war? These are all very valid questions. They could have provided insight on these matters through an information dumpy introduction, which would have been a bad idea, of course. They could have woven it into conversations, scrolls, and scriptures, and that would have added to the immersion aspect of the game, but it also might have made the pace suffer a bit. And you can tell that the guys behind Tyranny wanted to make the story in the game lean and fast-paced without sacrificing the robustness of its lore, which is probably the best thing this game has. They also wanted to give your character a sense of purpose. They wanted the stakes of your adventure to be high from beginning to end, and they wanted the people involved, your allies, and the people resisting Kairos' advances not to be mere quest-giving devices. They wanted you, the player, to be familiar with these things and care about them in some capacity without information dumping the living hell out of the story and its characters.
Well, alright.
And the game is so committed to putting you in the driver's seat of the adventure that they even give you input on your recent past action.
What?
And in order to get all of that done, they devised this absolutely fantastic conquest system. In it, you get bits of narration telling you about previous episodes in the history of the war, but they also ask you about how you sorted them out. You can choose which theater of operations you participated in, the things you became involved with, and how you dealt with them. What a brilliant way to sidestep the information dump device, huh? And these decisions have far-reaching implications story-wise. If you treated this or that community with fairness and empathy during the minigame, their attitude towards you will be amicable and welcoming. If you decided to appoint a certain army as protectors of this or that place, that's the army you are going to have to fight if you decide to betray the Overlord later on. And this is all mind-blowingly
amazing.
Now I want every game to have this. The other thing that turns character progression on its ear in this game is the spell crafting system. You could say this is a secondary mechanic because of how it works, but it definitely takes a front row seat in this game, becoming perhaps the most important resource at your disposal for combat situations. Throughout your journey, you'll find and learn sigils, from scrolls that are lying around in the world and from the writings on dungeon walls. I guess in this game, reading the writing on the wall goes a long way. These sigils are types of magic: illusion magic, vitality magic, frost magic, healing magic, etc. And you also learn expression sigils and accent sigils, and these allow to build your spells however you wish. And I think that as a concept, this is ridiculously awesome. This is what I call putting you in the driver's seat. Let's take the sigil of illusion for example. If you choose this sigil and combine it with a focused extent expression sigil, you can craft the spell of Spectral Blur, which deflects 30% of incoming hits and graces, making the target of the spell significantly harder to hit. Then you can throw in additional bonuses to make the spell stronger or last longer, or to reduce its cooldown time for example. But if you use that same sigil and combine it with a Distant Impact sigil instead, you can create the Fake Pit spell, which knocks enemies down on their asses. And if you throw the Sigil of Strength, you can make the spell harder to resist, but if you throw in the range sigil, you can affect targets that are farther away. So you can use this spell to knock down enemies that are beating the crap out of your tank, or you can use it to incapacitate targets that are making your life miserable from the back of the enemy lines. If you're a fan of Thor, for example, you can create different spells based on the Sigil of Lightning. You can create a spell combining the Sigil of Lightning with the Sigil of Material Force to create the Static Charge spell, which adds additional lightning damage to your weapon. And you can create the Electric Jolt spell using the Sigil of Lightning with a Distant Impact sigil. And you can have both of these spells as part of your arsenal, if you have enough spell slots. And you can of course further tune these sigils with accents to make them hit harder or from farther away, if you have sufficient lore skill of course. And the array of options for these sigils is crazy good, dudes. You can turn a spell into an AoE spell at the cost of strength, which works really well for spells that are meant to work as crowd control spells of sorts. In truth, I didn't pay much attention to this mechanic during my first playthrough, but it grew on me to the point that I can confidently say it's one of my favorite things about this game. You can even turn Barak into a paladin kind of tank, who can cast minor defensive and healing spells on himself. There is however a bit of a downside to this. Quite a significant downside actually. Everyone in your party can use spells as long as they have enough lore, which is the required skill for sigils. And the most powerful versions of these spells are straight out better than most offensive skills in your talent trees. So this may lead you to focus on boosting lore on all your magic user companions to make the most powerful versions of your favorite spells available to all of them. And this may end up homogenizing Ebb, Sirin, Landry, and even your main character if he or she's a magic user.
It's the same!
And this may get to the point that you'll barely be able to tell them apart as party members. Like some other things in Tyranny, character creation in this game tries hard to be unique, but it doesn't always succeed in making its uniqueness come across as fun or even useful. It does however succeed in the one thing that matters the most in character creation, which also happens to be the game's main selling point. It helps you navigate combat and social situations in this game your way, and that's always a good thing. Gameplay. Gameplay in Tyranny consists of combat, exploration, questing, and stronghold management. And this is more or less the standard CRPG package, but in Tyranny, each of these aspects has something that makes it feel different from anything we've experienced before, something unique if you would. The developers went to great lengths to make everything feel like a relevant part of your adventure. Combat, exploration, even itemization feel like they are a part of a much larger cohesive whole. And let's start with combat. I'll give you the quick version first. Combat in this game is Choking Point Simulator 1.0, and I'm not even kidding you. The longer version is a tad more complicated. Let's get into it. There is some fun to be had with the combat in Tyranny, but compared to its most important peers, it is not great. Combat encounters are quick, and most of the time there's a sense of urgency or gravitas to them. But if combat is your jam and you feel like the story should only be there to serve as a believable excuse for combat to occur, you are not going to have a good time with Tyranny. Let's talk about the combat encounters per se. At first it would seem like the game's enemy AI is smarter than in most games. In Pillars of Eternity, for example, in most encounters, if you send your tank to engage a group of enemies, because engagement works almost like a magnet, you'll then be able to safely send the rest of your party to spank the mobs at will, and you can rest assured that enemies won't ever turn their attention to anyone other than the tank. In Tyranny, enemies tend to disengage your tank and go after the companion who has the weakest armor, or less health, or the one who's doing the most damage. So they sound like smart enemies, right? If you also factor in that your tank's taunt ability shares recovery time with his standard attacks, and yes, I know that's how CRPGs work, it's not easy to keep enemy damage funneled onto your tank. You almost have to predict when the enemy is about to disengage to taunt him ahead of time. That is, if you don't discover that the enemy AI tends to go full TikTok user when you pull enemies away from their starting location. What I mean by this is that enemies in Tyranny abandon pursuit when you pull them too far away. And worse yet, most of the times, all of them except one or two will quit chasing you, and these guys of course become sitting ducks with this tactic. And the problem is that you can beat 40% of the combat encounters in this game by resorting to this despicable tactic. Then there's 40% of combat encounters that you can resolve by pulling enemies into a choking point, having your tank frontline the shit out of them, and making your DPS spank them to hell and gone. So the remaining 20% of the fights are combat encounters in which you can't do that. Boss fights that might require a little bit of micromanagement and creative thinking, surprise motherfucker you're surrounded fights, and some other minor variants. And these are the exciting combat encounters in this game. Enemy variety in Tyranny is somewhat lacking compared to other titles in the subgenre, but worse yet, enemy attacks in this game are limited to standard ranged attacks, melee attacks, and incapacitating attacks that don't last too long. That's all you can expect from enemies in Tyranny. Oh, and these disfavored assholes and some other baddies regenerate health over time, which only makes fights last longer and become more tedious because there is no real risk of losing these encounters if you have decent gear. Aside from some corridors, stairs, and doorways that you can use as choking points, level design adds nothing to the combat in this game. I don't expect the level design to weigh in a la XCOM, or, to mention a few games from the genre, Divinity Original Sin 2 or Solasta, but the level design in Tyranny feels flat and unimaginative for combat purposes. There is a crescendo of stakes and emotions during the final stretch of the game, but unfortunately, combat is not up to par with it, as you end up fighting regular groups of mobs. And because you are in the driver's seat of the story, the final boss will depend on who you decide to ally yourself with and who you decide to kill the last. This is very interesting from a narrative perspective, but I don't think those who are all about combat in RPGs are going to love it. I will say this though, the game keeps things interesting with a great variety of combat situations. Sometimes you have to hold the line, sometimes you have to come to a town's rescue and fight off invaders, sometimes the shit hits the fan and you have to fight your way to make an escape, etc. And the best part is that these situations will likely vary from playthrough to playthrough depending on your decisions. As far as boss fights go, you can forget about fighting dragons, demonic insects, stone golems, or giant worms. This is what a boss fight looks like in Tyranny. As for the questing, the structure of the vast majority of the quests in Tyranny is that of a FedEx simulation adventure, and yet many of them are amongst the most interesting quests I've done in an RPG. Some of them have multiple potential resolutions, some of them have large implications in the grand scheme of things, some of them allow you to gain loyalty amongst your followers or your allies, but more importantly, none of them feel like time-consuming filler side quests, and I definitely approve of this. These quests are also deeply imbued with the game's lore, and because of that, all of them help you strengthen your grasp on the world's politics, ethnicities, history, and even your own boss's autocratic regime. But as robust as these quests are in terms of lore, they never come across as dense or boring because the narrative is always kept lean and to the point. And that's not an easy thing to do, and writers deserve a lot of credit for that. Let's talk about exploration now. The way I see it, exploration in an RPG usually involves navigating a map and finding locations and landmarks that you may enter and explore further, or simply loot. But it also takes place in dungeons and open areas where you find secret rooms filled with treasure, mysterious caves that are off the beaten trail and are inhabited by dangerous monsters, or clearings where there are hermits willing to share their campfire and a story or two. Well, there is none of that in Tyranny. And I am not a fan of that, because I like my exploration. But I get it, Tyranny is all about the story, and if there is no exploration in Tyranny, it's because the developers and writers wanted to keep everything grounded and relevant to the story. Every location in Tyranny appears on your map because you're given a mission that requires you to go there. And the vast majority of these locations are small areas that are barely there as an excuse for you to meet the character you have to talk to or engage in the combat encounter that stands between you and completing your mission. Some locations are a little bit bigger, and in them you'll find a few areas that are locked behind skill checks, and this makes those locations feel a little bit more adventure-y, but not by much. You do have a larger than usual location known as the Old Walls in Tyranny. This is the equivalent of the Endless Paths dungeon in Pillars of Eternity, and there are several entrances to this dungeon scattered throughout the game's world. Which is actually kind of cool, because it gives you the feeling that there is this mystical underground ruin that is but a remnant of a forgotten world, and there is something evil brewing in there. As a concept, this location had potential, and one of the DLCs tried to make the most out of it, and I would say it partially succeeded. The thing is that this is the standout dungeon in this game, but if we judge it by the combat that takes place in it and its exploration value, it is little more than a poor man's Endless Paths. And this is partly because there's only one fucking type of enemy in this dungeon. It has 3 variants, but that's about it. You also have stronghold management in Tyranny, and there are a few interesting things about it. The developers clearly wanted this to be an important part of the experience, but they also didn't want it to get in the way of the other stuff that you do in this game. But I don't think they succeeded in integrating stronghold management seamlessly into the whole of the experience, and here is why. Throughout the game you'll be finding and conquering spires, and on top of each of these spires you can build facilities, forges, libraries, infirmaries, etc. You can build 1 facility per spire, and these facilities offer interesting perks. The forge, for example, allows you to enhance your weapons and armor, and those enhancements can make quite the difference in combat, even if they are generic as fuck. The thing is that you can only enhance your weapons and armor if you have a forge, and if you are at the forge. And depending on the quality of the item, you'll need a certain number of recruits in addition to the materials needed to perform the enhancement. Now, in Pillars of Eternity, for example, you have the enchantment button, which allows you to enhance your items on the fly in multiple ways if you have the ingredients. No need to bother building up a forge, hiring people, and going back there every time you want to improve an item. But in Tyranny, if you are immersed in the game's world, all this struggle you have to go through before you can add a +1 deflection bonus and a -0.05 recovery time bonus to your armor brings a refreshing feeling of accomplishment, just like the one we got from some of our favorite games of old when we found that hammer that gave us a +1 attack bonus after 20 hours of adventuring. Unfortunately, the game's challenge does not force you to make the most out of these facilities and their perks, even in the highest difficulty level, and that is a pity. There is also the fact that every spire looks the same, and you may have trouble remembering which facility you installed on which spire, which would be helpful if this information came up as a tooltip when you hovered your cursor over the spire on the world map. I also have a question about these spires and their facilities. What happens when it rains? Overall, gameplay in Tyranny is a case of the whole being much greater than the sum of the parts. This game thrives on making every aspect of the gameplay feel like something unique, but more importantly, everything the game has to offer, combat, questing, fortress management, everything is, at the end of the day, part of an array of tools that allows you to interact with the story and make it your own. And as such, even with all its flaws, gameplay in this game is outstanding. Story and lore. This time I think it's worth dissecting this category into at least 2 blocks, lore and writing. I know the lore is also part of the writing, but just bear with me. And writing in turn can be separated into 2 categories, story and dialogue. Let's start with the game's lore, because Tyranny's is abso-fucking-lutely
amazing.
It's nothing like I had ever seen. It's expansive, cohesive, and immersive. It's filled with vibrant places and people, all of which have a history of long-standing rivalries with neighboring towns, traditions, ethnicities, you name it. The people who live in the southern tiers of Tyranny have all stood against Kyros's rule in the past, and against each other. And all of this is properly documented and elaborated further upon in this game. And I think it's awesome that the game never force feeds you any of this. You can simply get the quick version of all of this if you focus on your mission and your companions, or you can milk the juice out of the game's lore if you exhaust every dialogue option in every conversation and read every piece of scroll that comes your way. The art deserves a special mention here, even if we're going to talk about it further later, because it brings this game's ginormous personality to life. This game has character and heart like few other RPGs out there, and the lore doesn't feel like it was specifically conjured up for the game. It feels like a world that extends far beyond the confines of what we see. It has been around for a long time, and we only just walked into it for a brief moment of its massive history. And this is something that can be said of precious few games out there. And it is also noteworthy that Tyranny is not at all derivative of D&D, The Lord of the Rings, or Arthurian dark fantasy. It is its own thing, and that alone deserves all the credit in the world. As for the game's story, it is fresh and enticing, and this is in part due to the fact that it is free of most of the genre's most overused tropes and cliches. For starters, the bad guy has already conquered the entire world except a tiny blot down in the south. And secondly, it is your job to conquer that remaining rebel bastion. So how's that for a revolutionary spin of the wheel in the genre? But the very best thing about this game, what makes Tyranny truly shine, is that, with the exception of Fallout New Vegas, it puts you in the driver's seat of the story like no other game. No other game. Let that sink in. Hello, Sink. I have played Tyranny 3 times, and I feel like I've played 3 alternate final cuts of the game. That's how much player decision-based replay value this game has. The allies you gather throughout the game depend on your decisions. Whether you have to defend or invade a fortress depends on your decisions. The places you end up going to, the people you end up meeting, the chunk of the old walls dungeons that you get to explore, hell, even your main mission's objective may change depending on your decision story-wise. And this is just mind-blowingly awesome. But we do have to address the elephant in the room, and that is the writing itself, the way in which the narration and the conversations are written, to be more specific. Unfortunately, this is not always up to par with the game's lore or the story itself. Tunon, Sirin, maybe Lantry, maybe Ebb, sometimes Graven Ash, and sometimes your other allies and enemies think, talk, and act as though they are the product of this world's history and its social dynamics. I believe them as characters, I buy them as part of the package. But there is also a lot in this game that shatters my immersion to pieces. For example, the Archons who lead Kyros's armies are supposed to be competent, seasoned war veterans with untold magical powers who have lived for hundreds of years. By the time you meet them at the disfavored camp, they should have long since learned the lessons of restraint, diplomacy, and how to keep their emotions in check. And yet, they constantly bicker about stuff that has no bearing on the mission at hand, they throw blame and unsubstantiated accusations at each other, and even in the face of imminent annihilation, they reason as though they were modern-day teenagers on Twitter bickering about whether the upcoming Little Mermaid film is progress and saving lives, or the harbinger of the end of days. The disfavored are supposed to be stoic, disciplined, well-trained, and battle-hardened, but the game needs to remind us of this constantly because they keep showing us people who are the exact opposite of this. This woman, for example, I ended up killing her because her story was so poorly written that I got pissed and took it out on her.
This is serious.
It is, Jon Snow, almost as much as the prospect of a world that is going to be consumed by a horde of nasty magical undead creatures. And this seriousness elicits compromise and sacrifices, especially during wartime. Crimes sometimes have to be forgiven, pride has to be swallowed, and personal problems have to be swept under the rug. And this is a lesson that you learn during wartime, or a persistent situation of bloody civilian unrest, or famine, whether you like it or not. It happens naturally. The story in this game revolves around people who are hanging by a thread as they try to survive an autocratic rulership. And because of that, it juggles with themes such as authority, sacrifice, and compromise, all within the context of the yoke of a tyranny. And I don't think the writers in this game, as competent as they are, know the first thing about authority, compromise, and sacrifice in times of war. Lucky them, I suppose. Fortunately, for every middle-aged character in this medieval fantasy world that talks and behaves like a modern-day teenager, for every childish rant about a sacrifice that you simply do not question during a time of war, there is a thought-provoking pearl of wisdom, a humbling war story, and a believable change of heart from an important character. And these things are becoming harder and harder to find in modern-day entertainment, so I'll take them, even if a large portion of the dialogues and narrations undo the atmosphere of severity this game is supposed to have.
But Alex, you always say this about the dialogue and narration about all games. Is there any game out there that gets it right in your opinion?
Why, of course. Check out Greedfall. The RPGs by Iron Tower for the most part get it right. Tainted Grail Conquest gets it right. Even the Witcher series. Also, know that this game is mildly contaminated with a post-2016 disease that has been spreading like wildfire in entertainment. Luckily, even when it's at its worst in Tyranny, it's never as bad as it is in games like the Pathfinder series, especially Kingmaker, Siege of Dragonspear, or The Outer Worlds, so it didn't really ruin the experience for me. Now don't get me wrong, what you get in Tyranny in the story and lore department is top tier stuff. You get a unique and robust lore, you get a story that feels fresh and different, you get high stakes and gravitas, and more importantly, you get to be in the driver's seat of the story. And that all by itself deserves a "Ye Old Gamer Recommends" label. But it's not without its problems. Companions lore-wise. Siren is one of my favorite companions ever in a video game. Her story is incredible. It provides insight on Kairos' faction, it houses tiny details about the other Archons, and some of the history and places in the world of Tyranny, which is where the story takes place. But more importantly, it shows glimpses of the process of dehumanization that takes place when a totalitarian regime like Kairos' succeeds. Her story is dark, but also immersive and thought-provoking. And for the most part, Siren's personality feels like it was shaped by the events, places, and people in her story. But I admit that I probably wouldn't consider Siren to be my favorite companion if I hadn't read her full story, which is one of the stories included in the collection of short stories that comes with the Overlord edition of the game. Her story is hands down the best story in that book. I strongly recommend, by the way, that you read this collection of short stories. Not all of them are good, the first ones are even poorly written, but at least 3 of them are fantastic. I read them before my second playthrough, and it made a world of difference. The game just draws you in a different way after you've read these stories. Siren is my favorite, but the rest of your companions constitute a solid bunch. I especially like Landry. He has a lot of relevant things to say about your mission, the locations you visit, and the ongoing internal conflicts between some of the factions. He also has a rock-solid motivation to tag along for the ride, and a lot of personality quirks that make him unique and likable. He's borderline clownish at times, but always at a tolerable level, and he has sensational voice acting. Verse is probably my least favorite because I strongly dislike the archetype of the chaotic, unruly, foul-mouthed chick that's overly violent and aggressive because she's had a troubled past. It comes off as cartoonish and irritating, you know the type. Nasty in Elex, Jack in Mass Effect 2, etc. She has great voice acting though, and a cool companion quest, so I'll let some of my criticism slide. The Bones for Kills and Shadows character were good, but her dialogue lines absolutely ruined the whole thing for me. She is a beast woman, a species of sentient anthropomorphic-ish beasts that live in the pseudo-civilized tribes. As a concept, these beings are cool, and even Kills in Shadow makes a compelling case for a companion. But the way in which she speaks is wildly inconsistent. She doesn't use prepositions properly, or at all, but her vocabulary is suspiciously rich when she's conveying complex ideas or talking about complex situations. But when they want to make her come across as brutish, she goes full TikTok user mode and fails to articulate even the most basic sentence properly. Then you have Barrick. I must admit this character eventually grew on me. I wasn't at all crazy about him at first. The writers went to great lengths and into great detail trying to explain how Barrick came to be trapped inside his armor. They even explained details about how he deals with, number 1 and 2. But I found this story to be way beyond my suspension of disbelief capabilities, and I simply never bought it. And during my first playthrough, he came off as stubborn and irritating. It almost felt like he was refusing to have a character arc. But if you play your cards well, you may actually succeed in swaying him over to your cause and way of thinking. Hell, he might even change his mind about a few important things. He is no Virgil from Arcanum though. He still comes off as very unlikable no matter what you do, but he has the potential to be an interesting character, and it is up to you to unlock said potential. Then you have Ebb. I'm not in love with her personality or her whole tide-waving deal, but I find it pretty freaking remarkable that as a companion, her attitude, her interventions, and the conversations she has with you may vary greatly depending on whether or not you decide to follow through with Kyrus's plan. That's something you don't often see in games. As a whole, I'd say your companions in Tyranny are interesting. You have a standout character, a couple or three of very solid ones, and a few more that are at least okay-ish. Companions gameplay-wise. Well, in this category, you have the great, the good, the meh, the bad, and the ugly all rolled into one. So let's break it up. The great. First, each companion has his or her own talent tree, and these are character-specific, not class-specific abilities. That makes each of them unique. In theory. Second, whenever you use coercion to get your companions to do what you want, you earn fear. If you go for the conciliatory and empathetic approach, you gain loyalty. And there are special combined abilities in this game that you can unlock by reaching certain thresholds of fear or loyalty with your companions. These are coordinated attacks or defensive moves between you and your companions that make a monumental difference in combat encounters. You and Verse, for example, have this move in which you launch her into the air, and while she's airborne, she dishes out a series of arrow strikes on the selected target. This is an amazing way to reward your particular style of leadership. A way that has an actual impact on the way your party operates during combat. The good. First, you can somewhat tune your companions to your preferred brand of tanking or healing or DPSing with your sigils, because you can also assign sigil spells to your companions if they have the appropriate level of lore. So if you think Ebb has interest in crowd control abilities but not enough damage, you can always assign a few extra damage spells. Second, Lantry has non-combat abilities that come in handy when you're exploring the old walls. The meh. First, unfortunately, because sigils are so powerful and because at least 3 of your companions will likely have a decent level of lore, you'll probably end up undoing all their uniqueness in favor of a more efficient build based on the most powerful versions of the spells they can handle. The bad. If you don't like Lantry's brand of healing or Barrick's tanking, well then fuck you, because you can't recruit or create custom-made adventurers. You have to make do with what you have. Tyranny tried hard to be unique, and the gameplay aspect of your companions was no exception, but this uniqueness wasn't all that fun or useful in this respect. So they get A for effort, but not a very good score, unfortunately. Secondary mechanics and user experience. There is item management, trading, training, and crafting in Tyranny. Item management and trading work just as they do in the first Pillars of Eternity game. The item management and trading interface displays your selected companions and your other companions' inventory, so you can compare every item in their inventories to everyone else's equipment. You also have an unlimited stash, like every other isometric RPG should have. This system is not bad, but it has its problems. And these problems became obvious when the improved version of this system was introduced in Pillars of Eternity 2. Being able to browse your companion's inventory on the fly and being able to compare the items there to everything else is cool in theory. But 2 rows of inventory space per companion is just not enough given the large amount of loot there is in this game. Also, when you change companions, if you happen to have items that may be useful to more than one companion in any of their 2 inventory rows, these items will leave the party with them, and it can be a small annoyance to bring them back. But other than this, the system is what a proper inventory system looks like. Trading is also seamless and intuitive, and you have this transitory trading space that allows you to make last-minute operations with your items before you trade, like switching companions and comparing what you're about to sell to their currently equipped gear. Training is pretty straightforward, and it is as simple as clicking on the skill you want to improve until you can improve it no more. And crafting is intuitive once you have the forge, but the game is not particularly good promoting its own features in the crafting department, which means that you more or less have to go out of your way to find out how it's done. The user experience in Tyranny's core gameplay aspects is not terrible, but also shockingly worse than it was in Pillars of Eternity in many respects. The worst offender by a mile is that the game does not respect your formations when you switch locations or in cutscenes. And this is Black Geyser levels of bad. And the only fights that I had difficulty with in this game were those that came immediately after a cutscene or an area transition. Fuck you games that do this. Also, bringing up the map shows the locations within the area where you're at, rather than the area itself. The area map is at the bottom corner of your screen, and it's not a very good map. I can't remember if pressing the M key is the default way to bring up the map, or if I changed it on the key binding panel, but I do know that pressing the map key brings up the map, but it doesn't close the map interface when pressed again. And I thought that was terribly annoying because I kept forgetting that the map was not an area map, and when I wanted to simply close the map again, I had to press the X icon on the interface. The map should have been a detailed area map, not this. This should be a tooltip to bring up with a hover event on the world map, in my opinion. As a whole, secondary mechanics and user experience are not the best, but they're certainly nowhere near the worst. Sound effects and mix.
You got it. No.
Get back here!
Can't wait to try that.
No can do.
After 4 playthroughs, I still had to go back and play for a little bit and pay special attention to the sound mix to be able to write this review. That should tell you all you need to know. Nothing about the sound bothered me as much as it did in the original Pillars game. I hated the sound mix in that game, and some sound effects were just unacceptable for a game that came out in the year 2015. But I also didn't find any of the sounds to be memorable, like the crit sound and animation that you get in Black Geyser when you annihilate an enemy, or the detail of the charge, release, and trajectory sounds for some spells in Solas the Crown of the Magister. Tyranny's sound is not great or terrible, and I really have nothing more to say about it. Music.
I need to try a different tactic. This isn't working.
The art package in Tyranny deserves a special mention in every aspect. This game has its own brand of medieval fantasy, and it's all because of its awesome art. The art in Tyranny infuses the game with a larger-than-life personality. It's unique, it's cohesive, it's immersive. These guys really knew what they were going for with their art. All the kudos in the world to the art director and the artists in this game. And this of course includes music. The music in Tyranny may not be my favorite on a track-per-track basis, but it's exactly how I like my music in video games. When it steps forward to accompany the action, it's epic and grandiose, and when it takes the backseat, it's always in tune with the mood of the passage. Every event, like the undoing of an edict, have their own adequate musical snippet, and I loved it. Voice acting.
That's 4 reports of avalanches in the mountains now. The Tearsmen can barely count past 9. They have neither the capacity nor the cause to close off the mountain passes. Either way, that leaves the 2nd and 4th cohort trapped outside the valley.
Or it's the work of your perfidious Earthshakers. Only a fool would not suspect a traitorous Archon of poisoning the mind of his students with sedition. We would have killed the Earthshakers Guild for their master's treachery, but I'm sure you have some perfectly valid reason for allowing them to live as your pawns.
Much has happened since I dispatched you on that mission. With Kairos' mandate that only one Archon may rule the Tears, the verdict is now more important than ever. We cannot allow this conquest to descend into total anarchy.
Sorry to interrupt, but I highly doubt it's gibberish. More likely, it's one of the local scripts. I'm Sage Lantry, one of the hired quills that was coordinating missives between the Vendrian Guard captains. They aren't paying me anymore and aren't coming to my rescue. So I'll decipher that parchment for you. That's what smart prisoners do, right? Make themselves useful.
This game features competent voice acting and voice direction. In some cases, it's beyond competent. Your companion Lantry is probably the best amongst your allies, but it's the voices of Narat who steals the show here by a mile, even if his lines aren't always good. But I have 2 big problems with the voice acting in this game. First, it's not entirely voiced. And you know, it's an all or nothing deal for me in this department. And second, some people were definitely not the best casting choices. Patrick Seitz plays Barrick on this game, and that's the same guy who played the scholar Kana in Pillars of Eternity. And he probably was the right choice for Kana, but he absolutely didn't work as Barrick for me. Kills in Shadow sounds laughable, but I think the problem is that her voice could have used a little bit more post-production. One of the voices that you can choose for your PC is Matthew Mercer's, and that's the guy who plays Adair in Pillars of Eternity. And I could have sworn that some of his lines are exactly the same as the ones he has in Pillars when you move him around.
Can't do that. Have a look here. Sorry, I can't.
The rest of the cast does the best they can with the lines they've been given, even when they are often not the greatest. Graphics. I love the art in this game. This is one of the most cohesive and immersive graphic packages I've ever seen in an isometric CRPG. If I had to level some criticism at it, I would say that towns like Lethian's Crossing and dungeons like the Old Walls could have used a little bit more detail. Lethian's Crossing could have had more worn-out tiles, more citizens going on about their business, more non-interactable merchants, perhaps a few animals, and so on and so forth. The gear you find and the clothes you wear could have also used a bit more diversity, and the devs could have made them look a little bit cooler on you. But character models, locations, and NPCs look fantastic in this game. The Scarlet Chorus and the Disfavored each have their own distinctive brand of evil, and this comes with its own brand of style and color. Also, I ask you guys who have played this game, who of you doesn't have this picture immediately come to mind when you hear the mention of the name Tunon the Adjudicator? The iconography and style of the interface is also consistent and immersive, though not always practical, and the maps and stills are simply
amazing.
The Overlord edition ships with an art book, and after scoping it out, I would say we got the best of everything. We even get a few wallpapers with the Overlord edition. I made Tunon's court my phone's lock screen, by the way. Overall, really good stuff. Performance and stability. There are a few bugs to speak of here and there. Changing characters in the first Spire behaved erratically at first. Some characters disappeared. Eb lost her clothes at some point, but that one I didn't mind too much. There are parts of the game in which the FPS went down enough for me to notice, and if I noticed, that means that it is a pretty steep drop. But outside all of these issues, most of which I consider to be minor problems, everything ran fairly smoothly for the most part in Tyranny. Other considerations and final thoughts. I don't think Tyranny is this grossly underrated / overlooked title that everyone should know about and appreciate more. I think everyone in our gaming community more or less knows about this game. I think people were just not thrilled with what it had to offer. And I think this is for various reasons. First, there is no question that because of its theme, its approach to the story, and because of how much it tried to do its own thing, Tyranny is a niche game within the CRPG ballpark. Second, when you eat rice on a daily basis, it's really hard to forgive a dish that has rice in it for not having decent rice, even if everything else is well cooked and all hot cuisine. And that's combat for you in Tyranny. Third, the final stretch of the game is structured in a way that makes the ending come across as abrupt and the game itself as unfinished. But one thing that I'm always on the hunt for is games that put you, the player, in the driver's seat of the experience. And what I mean by this is games that reward your decisions with content and consequences. Games that open up and close roads for you to follow depending on your choices. And I am always on the hunt for those because there are not too many games that do that. And Tyranny is, with one notable exception, the best in this department. And that alone warrants a solid recommendation from this channel. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, thank you for watching all the way up until now. If you like what you are seeing in this channel, please consider subscribing and clicking that notification bell to avoid the usual YouTube shenanigans. Share the video, but most importantly, never stop gaming, but don't let gaming get in the way of your hopes and dreams. Bye everyone.